I mean, don't get me wrong, the prequels were heavily influenced by CGI for no reason. But I think it was more of because George Lucas liked to push the envelope when it came to special effects, which is perfectly fine by me.
Which is unfortunate because when the original special effects that he developed back in the 70s and 80s were just as good quality as any CGI.
Well, that's because practical special effects will always beat out digital.
Precisely.
And they're actually cost effective. So. Give it a few more minutes, and then we'll see where this takes us.
Can't even see your screen.
Oh, that's because I had the light on. You can flip it, actually. Thank you, Sean.
Still barely see it.
Partly is because I don't know what
Because you need a new projector.
No, that's a brand new one. Like, I've had this for maybe less than a year, and it's not very bright. It's either that or I need to clean the lens, but it's also partly because the background is really dark. Like, it's, for whatever reason, it's a dark gray. So, because when I put on other stuff, it will work just fine. All right. Well, I'm going to skip through my usual introduction because my usual introduction doesn't really need anything because everybody's been here before. But here's our agenda. We're going to focus on defining world building, talking about the world building Bible, which you guys have kind of a list in front of you. And then I'm going to talk about briefly how world building fits into Avatar: The Last Airbender, and then I got some tips for world building, and then we have our writing prompt. So I'm going to skip that bit. Okay, so defining world building. World building is it's the process of creating a fictional world, often used to describe a creative component like plot or character. Most of the time you see this in fantasy and science fiction, more so than anything else. You do see it a little bit in elements of horror, and there's usually some internal components of world building, especially if there's special rules. Like, for example, if you have something set in the real world, everyone can understand that it's set in the real world, but if you have like a special organization or something like that, then there's world building rules that get applied to that organization or that group of people. So it can be as complex as creating an entire universe with its own history and laws of nature, or it can be as simple as slightly altering the details of our own world to fit the story. And then, so the world building Bible, so what you guys have in front of you is kind of a template, but it was developed by Ellen Brock, who's a professional freelance novel editor. And you can apply the elements that you think work best for your story and ignore the elements that are irrelevant or not as useful. The QR code that I have here is linked to the website that I pulled this all from. And I actually use this in a video series that I did on world building on the YouTube channel. But we'll go through each of these in turn. So you have... starting off, the natural world. This includes things like astronomic bodies, like planets, stars, suns, asteroids, stuff like that. Then you have bodies of water, geographic features, the common and rare plants and animals, and then the poisonous or medicinal plants. And then the next one is locations. You have natural formations, like mountains, valleys, canyons, stuff like that. Glaciers, monuments, so like any statue or any structure that is designed by a person and left to commemorate something, government facilities, travel hubs, shops and stores, living spaces, and then territories. The next one is travel. This is where you have restrictions on travel, dangerous locations, luxury and vacation spots, immigration and emigration. Participate with that because you have people traveling in and out of countries. Whether it's legal or illegal, it all gets tracked. Travel times, common travel methods, and then affordability. Let's see, then we've got architecture and infrastructure. So So this is like the physical features within a city, the things that help it operate. So you've got common and expensive materials, the appearance and layout of typical or expensive homes. So like your typical homes, more lower class, are going to have kind of a cookie cutter layout where everything's put together in a specific pattern. Whereas if you have something that's a little bit more of an expensive home, expensive materials, whatnot, you can actually customize that. Typically you see people customizing houses and stuff like that, especially nowadays. Then you have streets and walkways. Are your streets going to be paved, or are they going to be cobblestone, or are they just going to be dirt roads? Then you've got availability of plumbing and sewage, which is a big one. Garbage collection at the top of the second column, and then energy distribution. This is more for like advanced civilizations, especially once they get into an industrial age or beyond. And then burial practices. Burial practices is a big one, especially alongside with plumbing, sewage, and garbage collection, because civilizations have to get rid of the waste. Then we've got medicine. This involves curable and incurable diseases, common and rare diseases, availability and cost of medicine, legality of substances. Some substances are fairly legal, others are not. Then we've got professions, common and less common and rare professions, restrictions by gender, species, and education. The species thing is more like science fiction fantasy, but depending on what you're writing, that can change. And then unemployment rate, which is incredibly important because that feeds into the economy. So under economy, we have distribution of wealth, lifestyles by class, money, and bartering systems. And then we've got history, major world events, major wars, major natural disasters, the age of the civilization. So like, for example, I'm wearing a Star Wars shirt. The age of the civilization by the time we get to the films, like Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, the Galactic Republic has been around for thousands of years and has evolved over that time. Whereas when we get to the beginning of the original Star Wars film, A New Hope, the Galactic Empire has only been around for 20 years. Maybe 25 at pushing it by the time you get to the end of Return of the Jedi. Then you've got current and previous rulers, recent cultural shifts and changes. Then the next category is clothing. That's where we deal with cheap and expensive fabrics, styles by class, and differences by gender, region, and cultural groups. And then food plays into that, because now we're starting to get into the more cultural stuff. So food. This includes staple and luxury foods, availability of food, local and regional dishes, and then utensils. Now, if you go on the website that Ellen Brock put together, I'm past this page. My bad. It's the food. Like, it doesn't list anything about utensils when it comes to the category of food, but like, think about like, what are some dietary staples, things that people usually spend a lot more time eating? Like here in America, what's one of our dietary staples? Pizza's a common one, but I'm think more simple than that.
Sandwiches.
Even more simple than that. What do sandwiches get made on? Bread. So one of our dietary staples here in America is grain, okay? Specifically wheat and barley, all right? Whereas if you go over to the Orient, to China and Japan and Korea and parts of Southeast Asia, the staple food is rice. The staple grain is rice. Here in America, we have a lot more use of beef and cattle and stuff like that, more use of livestock. Whereas, again, you go back into, like, say, the Middle East, they're not going to be eating beef as much as they are going to be eating goat or sheep. Or if you go to India, they're not going to be eating beef at all because parts of India believe that cows are sacred. Or if you go to Japan, while they do have beef and they regularly, they also do chicken. But one of the main meat sources that they have is fish. So different cultures, different regions are going to have different dietary staples depending on what is most readily available for them. Then we jump to entertainment. So then we look at things like professional sports, hobby or schoolyard sports, board and card games, music styles and instruments, fictional themes and subject matter, restrictions, because in some countries of the world it is completely restricted to, you can't make movies, you can't read books. And maybe you can read books, but the books are incredibly specific as far as what you're allowed to read. Maybe imagery on your books or your movies or your TV shows is highly restricted. For example, in China, skull imagery is incredibly forbidden because they don't like the idea of it puts in a negative connotation, so they change that up. If you guys have ever heard of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, over in the UK, they freaked out over the word ninja. They thought it was too violent of a word. So when the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle movies were coming out back in the early 90s, even the cartoons back in the 80s, they started redubbing it Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. And then, of course, they freaked out about the nunchucks, and Michelangelo couldn't use nunchucks. So think about how those restrictions play in. And then there's the affordability of content or equipment. Back years ago, when I was a kid, a projector like the one I'm using right now would have been $500 to $1,000. Really expensive, hard to get your hands on one, unless of course you work at a school or you work at a business that requires the use of one. Now we've got devices that you can pick up on Amazon for $60. And then you can connect it to your phone or your computer and project whatever you want on it, including movies, TV shows, or what have you. So that affordability plays into it. In genres like cyberpunk, which is a subgenre of science fiction, in cyberpunk, technology is a big facet of that particular genre. People are wanting to get technology because technology can improve their life, but at some point there becomes a cost. In some cases, it can be the cost of part of their humanity. There are some versions of cyberpunk genres where people they want to live forever, and what they will end up doing is they will end up cloning themselves. But at what point do you stop being the original you? Or they might start replacing their limbs or their body parts with cybernetic enhancements. At what point do you stop being human and start becoming more of a machine? So that kind of affordability, that kind of accessibility, and that goes more into technology than anything else, and we'll come back to technology. Then we look at things like law, where you have criminal justice system, major and minor crimes, laws impacting daily life, that's a big one. Common sentences, police behavior, uniform practices and powers, prison conditions, and public opinion about law enforcement. In fact, law and politics are actually going to have a lot of stuff involved with public opinion. Same with magic and technology and religion. So then under politics, we have political parties. Is there one party? Is there multiple parties? How does that work in your world? Do political parties even exist? Type of ruler. So in my book series, I have a kingdom. It's not really a kingdom. It's a republic. It's called Qi-Sen, and they're governed by a senate, and above the senate is a chancellor who kind of oversees the decisions made by the senate. And the chancellor is that predominant leader. But then there are other kingdoms surrounding Qi-Sen that have monarchs and regents, or they have there's one kingdom that has 3 rulers, and they're called a triumvirate, and so they do everything in triplicate. Then you have prominent members of court and government, so these are the people who are important to the government structure, secret and public government agencies. Then you have public opinion about government. Then there's magic, and magic's got its own thing that gets involved, and there is a worksheet that I have for that if anyone's interested in getting a copy of that. But magic is a little bit more, it's focused more on more supernatural elements. It doesn't necessarily have to be technological, but I'll get to that in a moment. But you have common and rare spells and skills, common and rare potions, restrictions, prevalence of users, society's opinion of magic, and then magical requirements. And then under technology, you have the availability of tech, capabilities, weapons technology, levels of technology. So are they like at an industrial age? Are they at a digital age like we are now? Are they at like Stone Age technology where they've barely invented the wheel, and they're still using a chisel and hammer to write? How are they incorporating the levels of technology? This also includes entertainment technology. As entertainment changes, the technology changes around it, and vice versa. Energy creation is another one, and this goes back to infrastructure, and then transportation. Then you have religion. Major religions, dynamics between groups, places of worship, religious holidays, morals and beliefs, origins, prevalence, church and government separation. That last one's a big one, because in some countries in the world, if we were modeling it off of the real world, there are places where the religion goes hand in hand with government. Then we look at family. It's on the next slide. So family, we have typical marriage age, number of kids, dynamic and structure. And we have attitudes towards children, elderly, and romantic love. And these things may not be always the same. Like if you're writing something with a medieval setting, romantic love, while it seems to be the ideal, may not always necessarily be the case, because a lot of the times marriages, especially amongst nobility or royalty, were done as kind of a transaction to bridge peace or to build economic stability between two rivaling kingdoms. So consider that as you're working on a story. Then care for the elderly and children. Gender roles are a big thing, and then birth order importance. A lot of the times, if you look back at ancient texts, when a person is listed and they have children, usually the children are listed in the order in which they are born. In some cases, like for example in the book of Genesis, when it's talking about Isaac's children, Jacob and Esau, Jacob is actually the younger twin, but because he replaces Esau as the receiver of the birthright, they actually put his name first. So that actually switches. So even though it should have been listed Esau and Jacob in the order of birth, even though they're twins, Jacob, who receives the birthright, gets put first. So that takes us to education, where the typical education levels, subjects, school environment, availability and cost, gender and ability restrictions. Because in some places, girls aren't allowed to learn. And I'll come back to this in a moment when we're talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender. Under language, you've got primary and major languages, then you have regional or minor languages or even dialects. So like when I lived in Japan, the major language is Japanese. There were some minor languages that were spoken. For example, up near the northern part of Hokkaido, which is the northern island of the archipelago, there's a people group called the Ainu that were like Proto-Japanese. They're still speaking the Ainu language. There's some similarities, but it's incredibly different from traditional Japanese. On top of that, there are dialects depending on where you go. So I was living in Hiroshima, so people that I was living around had what was called the Hiroshima Ben, the Hiroshima dialect. But if you go to Osaka, they're speaking in a different dialect, and in Tokyo, they're speaking an even different dialect than that. Tokyo is a little bit faster paced, whereas down in Hiroshima, it's a little bit slower. Kind of similar to what you see when you go to different areas of the United States, and the United States is incredibly diverse as far as the dialects, because you could have a southern dialect, you can have a non-regional dialect, which is what is usually referred to as the California one. In fact, California has this fun little bit in its dialect where every time we finish off a sentence, we tend to have this upwards inflection, like everything sounds like a question. And if you catch yourself, you'll kind of laugh at it, because people will tend to end a sentence on that higher inflection rather than the lower inflection of a statement. Then you have prevalence of multilingualism, and this is where you're dealing with people who speak multiple languages. Like here in the United States, we have a lot of people who speak at least 2 languages. Most of the time it's just one because English is our predominant language, but you can have people who speak Spanish, who speak English. I know a couple of people who speak more than one language. But if you go to parts of Europe, like for example Belgium, students are required to learn 5 languages before they leave middle school. And they become fairly fluent in them. And those languages vary, but for the most part, the core languages are English, French, German, and I think whatever the other 2 are going to be, like either Spanish or Spanish, Italian, or they do Greek or something like that. I don't remember all of the languages that they're required to learn, but I know that it's like 5. And German, French, and English are core of them. Just because of because of the proximity of where Belgium is on the European continent, because it neighbors France and Germany, and then England is right across the English Channel. Then we have like colloquial phrases, slang, and curses. So like we might say something is cool or something is awesome, but like if you go back east to New England, I was visiting some friends over there when I was in high school, and this girl that I knew, her name was Sarah, everything was wicked awesome. That's wicked cool. And they would throw that word wicked in there, and I'm like, why? It's a completely added word. Why do you need that? So yeah, then we've got, the next category is races and species. So you've got your primary and major, and then you have minorities, dynamics, cultural disconnects, and then commonalities. And then weather, and you would think that weather would actually be under the natural world, but weather's kind of a separate thing all by itself, because weather is a different dynamic. So you have typical and atypical weather. So like here in Central California, this time of year, what's our typical weather? Hot, yeah, very good. What would be atypical for us right now? Not sun, definitely not sun. Like if we had torrential rains and storms, that would be atypical for us. Seasonal variations. Here in Central California, we do have some spring, we do have some fall, but our fall doesn't really vary from like summer into autumn into winter. We go from like summer to like slightly less hot summer, and then we hit winter. So there's no real in between here. Whereas you go to other parts of the United States, you'll get all 4 seasons, or you might see all 4 seasons in the span of like a week, depending on what part of the country you're in. Then you've got regional variations, seasonal clothing. So like here in Central California, our seasonal clothing is shorts, t-shirts, or a tank top. I'm wearing flip-flops today because I'm just not going to be wearing regular shoes and socks. But if it was wintertime and we're hitting 30 degrees, I'm not going to be wearing this. I'm going to be wearing long pants, long sleeves, a hoodie, or a jacket, something to keep me bundled and warm. I'm going to have socks on my feet. I'm going to have proper shoes because it's probably going to be wet and cold, and I don't want my toes to freeze off. And then the thing that you need to talk about is heating and cooling of homes. And while that filters back into like infrastructure and technology, it's something to consider. All right, so really quickly, I want to go over Avatar: The Last Airbender. Has anybody seen the show? Okay, so Avatar: The Last Airbender kind of falls into the category of fantasy because there are some fantasy elements, but let's take a look at how each of categories fits in. So like in the natural world, they have all the same things that we would have in the real world. They have geographic features. So we have the Fire Nation, which is an archipelago of volcanic islands. We have these chains of islands where we have the air nomads. We have this massive continent, which is the Earth Kingdom. Here's the capital of Ba Sing Se. And then we have the poles, which are the water tribe. And if you notice the way that they're structured on the map, they look kind of like their element. Because you've got water, fire, earth, and air. Now, there's all the things in the natural world exist. They have natural formations, they have monuments, like for example, there's one island called Kyoshi Island that is in honor of Avatar Kyoshi, who is one of Avatar Aang's predecessors. There's all these things. Now, where things get really interesting is like, for example, under the travel and the age of this world. Like, and this is where we're talking about like travel and history and stuff like that. By travel, for the most part, everyone sails on ships, standard traditional sailing ships, wood with canvas sails. The only industrialized country in this entire show, as far as the first 3 seasons of Avatar: The Last Airbender, is the Fire Nation. They have metal ships that run on coal and steam, and they have mechanized tanks that run on coal and steam, and they have a massive drill in season 2 that ran on coal and steam. But whereas if you go into Ba Sing Se, they have a train system, but that train system runs on earthbending, which is technically a magical skill. But as far as the history of this world, the age of the civilization is thousands of years old, and it evolved over time. If you go into the second season of The Legend of Korra, which is like the next phase of the Avatar cycle, there's an episode where they introduce the first Avatar. His name is Wan, and his story is that he lived on a city, or in a city that existed on the back of a lion turtle, or near a lion turtle, and these are massive spiritual creatures that grant the ability for temporary fire bending, or temporary earth bending, or temporary air bending. And come to find out, he is actually originally a firebender. And it's through him that the entire Avatar cycle begins, as far as which order things take place in. But he exists like thousands and thousands of years before Avatar Aang or Avatar Korra in the series. But then we take a look at the magic system in this. In the magic system, we have common skills, okay? So like, for example, waterbenders, the common skill is to make and manipulate water to move it around through the air. You can freeze it, you can turn it into mist, all right? You can unfreeze it at will, and you see this happen a lot. There's a reason why the waterbenders live at the poles, because water's their natural element, and they can manipulate it into building structures all over the place. In fact, at the end of season 1, when they get to the North Pole, you see that the entire capital city of the Northern Water Tribe is all made out of glacial ice. The gate is made of ice, and as people are sailing in, the waterbenders working the gate can work together to open and close the gate, which is just water that's being solidified or melted. It's really kind of cool. But there are additional skills that are rare. For example, in season 3, living in the Fire Nation, Team Avatar meets a woman named Hama, who's from the Southern Water Tribe. She escaped being imprisoned by the Fire Nation during the war, and she has developed a special skill called bloodbending. She connects with the water that is inside of a human being or a living animal, and she begins to manipulate it. She is strongest and able to do it on a full moon, because the moon actually holds tidal sway over water, which is actually a cosmological thing. It's actually something that exists in the real world, where the moon pushes and pulls on the tides because of its gravitational force and presence in its orbit around the Earth. And so she's able to use that skill to torture people. But then you've got restrictions. So after the events of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and they figure out what Hama is capable of doing, bloodbending is restricted. It becomes an illegal practice. It becomes a taboo, and people don't want to see that because of how dangerous it can be, because of how it can be used to harm other people. Whereas with like the firebending is a natural thing, but there's a rare skill called lightning bending, where benders, and this is typically seen in the royal family, where they can channel and redirect lightning. But by the time you get to the events of Legends of Korra, there's a character named Mako who is not only a firebender, a very good one, he's also a lightning bender, and he gets a job working at a power plant where he spends a few hours of his day using his skills to channel lightning into the generators to generate electricity for this city called Republic City. And so then you've got the prevalence of users. There's a lot of users throughout the major 3 areas. So there's a lot of firebenders, there's a lot of earthbenders, there's a lot of waterbenders. But by the time you get to by the time you get to the start of Avatar: The Last Airbender, there's a reason why it's called The Last Airbender. Aang is the last of his kind. There's an entire genocide, which is a major historical event, and he is literally the last one. And up until the point where he has his own kids, there are no other airbenders except for him. And so there's an episode in season 1 where he gets really excited about this idea that there might be other airbenders. He goes to a temple, a former airbender temple, and he sees people flying around on gliders. He's like, oh, there's other airbenders. No, what they're doing is they're using gliders and they're using jets of wind that are, it's compressed air to move them around and glide above the temple and land safely. They're not true airbenders, but they have the spirit of airbenders even if they don't have the skills. And while they don't have, while you don't, in the show you don't hear different languages, you do see different dialects, different slang and phrases and stuff like that. And Aang, who's actually like a 12-year-old kid when you meet him, he's actually over 100 years old because he was trapped in an iceberg. And so there's slang and references that he makes that nobody gets throughout the show because it's slang that was used a century earlier. Like he uses a phrase from the Fire Kingdom, it's flameo. Nobody in the Fire Kingdom understands that reference. Or he'll greet other firebenders as, greetings, my good hot men. Nobody understands the reference because they don't talk like that anymore. So when you're developing your world building, these are things that you want to pay attention to. So I want to focus on tips. All right, and there's a set of questions on the back of the sheet that's going to be used for the writing prompt. But so here are the tips that I have for you guys, and there's about 25, 26 of them, and we'll go through them fairly quickly so we can get to the writing prompt. The first one is you want to incorporate the elements that are necessary for your story. You don't want to use, so like if you're writing a story that isn't set with any kind of magic system or anything like that, disregard magic, okay? And Virginia, if you want to write on the page, you're more than welcome to. Yeah, you can mark that up all you want. Huh? Okay. Well, there's a pen back there if you want to borrow one. Okay. Yeah, so incorporate the elements that are necessary for your story. If I'm writing something that's set in a science fiction world, for the most part, I'm going into the hard sci-fi, I'm not going to incorporate magic, okay? But something like Star Wars uses it uses soft sci-fi because there are spaceships and there's lasers and stuff like that, but they also incorporate the Force, which is a type of magic. Tip number 2, give the locations nuance and detail to make them stand out. You don't want everything to look all the same. You don't want it to look uniform. One of the things that I think Star Wars is both good and bad at is that if you look through the original trilogy, every single location that they go to is an extreme. So Tatooine is a desert planet. The entire planet is a desert, okay? Hoth is an ice planet. Everything is just one gigantic ice cube. With rocky features. Cloud City sits above a gas planet, and it floats in the clouds. The problem is that these are extreme environments that, while you do have planets that are gas giants like Jupiter or Saturn or Uranus, that do exist out in outer space, not every planet you're going to come across is going to be a desert. And if it is, more than likely it's not going to be habitable. Mars, for example, is a desert. It has very little to no precipitation, very little to no water, but it's not a habitable planet because of the gravity and the lack of atmosphere. A breathable air. It has air, it's just not breathable for humans. But then you take a look at like a planet like Hoth, nothing should be capable of surviving there unless it lives underground near like the core of the planet. And the reason being is because based on its structure, it should be the furthest away from its star possible. Yeah. So if you watch Empire Strikes Back, which is the second of the original Star Wars trilogy, it's a planet where it starts off on that planet, and it's just one gigantic ice planet, is all it is. But
Is it a real planet?
no, it's not a real planet. It's all made up. But think about so if you are doing something with science fiction, think about where planets are located in conjunction with their star. Like Earth sits in a habitable zone that is perfect for us to maintain liquid water with some levels of frozen water, with earth and air and breathable atmosphere and stuff like that. The closer we get to the sun, the more of that is going to vaporize and burn away, like with Venus or with Mercury, where they have no atmosphere, or in Venus's case, an atmosphere that is entirely toxic and acidic. The further away you get, the colder it's going to get, because your planet is no longer in that habitable zone, meaning if there is life on that planet, chances are it's going to be living underneath the surface, closer to the planet's core or the moon's core, depending on what you're dealing with. All right. Then you also have to take a look at the density and the gravity and the mass of what that planet is. Like, we wouldn't be able to step foot on Saturn or Jupiter because of the intense gravitational forces. It would just crush us. The atmospheric pressure would just destroy us. So think about that when you're developing your storyline. Tip number 3, create a variety of transportation methods. All right, this can be something from trains, planes, and automobiles, and other type stuff, or it could be spaceships. It could be hovercraft of some kind. In my book series, I have what's called a slipgate. It's a magical spell that opens a portal, which just looks like a ripple in the air, and people can pass through it from one point to another. Basically, it's like a magically opened wormhole. Tip 4, consider faulty infrastructure inconveniences. So think what happens when infrastructure breaks down. How would a character be inconvenienced by, say, like the air conditioning going out when it's the middle of summer and it's 100 degrees outside? How inconvenienced would they be if the plumbing turned off, or there was no plumbing and they needed to use the bathroom, or they needed to get cleaned up in the shower? How do they go about doing that? What inconveniences them? What happens if it's a high-tech society and power goes out and they don't know how to operate without energy or power? What happens when that technology fails? So think about those inconveniences. Tip number 5, you want to plan out how your characters get treated for physical and mental illness. I didn't have enough space for mental, I guess, I don't know. But how characters get treated is going to be really interesting. Like, for example, going back to Avatar: The Last Airbender, there's an episode in season 1 where Avatar Aang's travel companions, Sokka and Katara, they both come down with what I'm essentially considering a flu, or like a really bad cold. They're delirious, they're feverish, and he's trying to figure out how to get medicine. There's nobody in town. The village has like one little old lady in it, and she's like, oh, you get a bunch of pond frogs. Right now they're frozen in the mud because it's still wintertime. If you can catch them when they're frozen, you can take them back. If you suck on them, they'll actually help relieve they secrete a mucus that helps relieve fevers and boost your immune system. And so he goes collecting these frogs, gets captured, the frogs thaw out while they're in his pockets, and they start bouncing out all over the place. So he has to go get more, and he finally gets them to his friends, and they're like, oh man, this feels so much better. Like they're sucking on a frog's butt. And they're like, this feels so much better. I can feel my fever breaking. And then they realize what is in their mouths and they get completely grossed out. Meanwhile, Aang is so tired from his ordeal that he just crashes out. So, but then in season 3, there's a character that is introduced. She's introduced in season 2. Her name is Princess Azula. She's the princess of the Fire Nation, and she actually has a psychological break before the end of season 3, and it's bad. Like she is emotionally compromised, and it all because of her family life and her family dynamic growing up, and she just has this break. And it's on the one hand, it's really sad to watch it, but it's so well written and and handled so well by the creators that you, despite the fact that she's a despicable character, you feel sympathy for her. Tip number 6: research job markets for the time and culture that's inspiring you. So if you're writing something that's medieval, you're not going to have an elevator repairman. You're not going to have someone who builds cars. You're going to have someone who builds wagons or shoes horses or is a blacksmith at some point, or maybe they're a farmer. If you're writing something that is technologically advanced, you're not going to have someone who is, you might, but the likelihood of having someone who publishes print books in a hyper-futuristic setting, most everything is going to be digital. We're seeing that now. Books and movies and everything is so digitized now that probably in 100 years we won't. Possibly, I could be wrong. I am hoping I'm wrong, but physical books won't even be a thing. All right. So think about how your time and culture is inspired and how those jobs are impacted. This also goes into economy as well. Think about what's happening here in our current world today. California's minimum wage for fast food employees went up to $20 at the beginning of April. And what you're seeing more and more is you're seeing fewer workers working in fast food industry, and you're seeing more automated systems put in place. We have mobile apps. You can go into the store and order. You can order online. They will cook it for you and deliver it to your house. You don't even have to leave your bedroom. So think about how that plays into the job markets as well. Tip number 7, explore how your characters in society think about wealth. Do they like wealth? Do they strive for it? Do they hate the wealthy? Do they resent the wealthy? How do they think about money? Then tip 8, consider the monetary system for your world. All right. Harry Potter has a great monetary system that you don't really understand what the exchange rate is, other than you have 1 gold galleon, which is equal to, I think it's like 5 silver sickles. 1 silver sickle is equal to 10 copper knuts or bronze knuts. I can't remember the exact exchange rate, but you have that delineation of 1 to 5 to 10. And then I do something similar with the currency in my system. They're called Drox, D-R-O-X, and I do something similar where they're using bronze, silver, and gold as the coinage metal, but maybe you're doing something that's a little bit more modern, so you're using some kind of credit system or digital currency like Bitcoin or something like that. Or maybe you're using paper money. Paper money is basically what we have that's considered money today. It's a banknote that says this is the value of $1. And while you can actually use it for all goods and services and trade, there are some places where they won't even accept cash anymore. You have to have digital currency. And vice versa. There are places that won't take digital currency. You can't use a debit card, you can't use a credit card, they want cash only because it is more stable. So think about the monetary currency. Tip number 9, create a history timeline to track causes and effects. On the companion site from my book series, I have a history timeline that shows all the major events going back thousands of years before the start of book one. And what this does is it helps me as the author track down everything that happened and how it leads to the cause and effect of everything else, because things don't happen in isolation. Consider this. World War I started because of an assassination. And what's interesting is that the end result ended with Germany being in such an impoverished state, such an economic downturn, that it opened the way for a guy named Adolf Hitler to rise to power. And he was all about promoting the wealth, the economy, and the rebuilding of his country. But he then used that to do horrible things, and it led to another world war. All right, so look at the causes and effects of that. It's like a tapestry. You can see the chain of events that take place that lead to this one large event. So large events don't happen in isolation. They happen because of smaller events that build up and build up and build up over time. Tip number 10, determine how leaders both influence and are influenced by culture. All right? We have political leaders now that are all over social media, whether they're on X or Instagram or TikTok or Facebook or YouTube, they're on there. In fact, there's an official YouTube page, there's an official account for everything involving the White House right now. And think about how they influence culture and what they are doing, what culture is doing to influence them. Tip number 11, you want to base your clothing on a character's economic status and where they live. All right. So if you have a character who is raised up in the northernmost reaches of Canada, they're typically going to be dressing really warm. All right, they're not going to be wearing shorts and a tank top and flip-flops because it's going to be way too cold come December. They're going to be wearing really warm clothing. My parents just got back from a trip to Alaska. They spent a week up there on a cruise. The average temperature at the end of May was 42 degrees in summer. Yeah. Fahrenheit. In Celsius, that would be like 98 degrees. All right. So you want to make sure that where they are living, the clothing is appropriate. So, like going back to my reference to Avatar: The Last Airbender, Sokka and Katara are from the Southern Water Tribe. As they travel north with Aang and they go into warmer, more temperate climates, you see that they actually shed their fur skin clothing and they're wearing more cloth fabric underneath. So they're wearing less layers. Whereas once they get back to the North Pole at the end of season 1, they're back in their parkas and their hooded jackets. So the clothing needs to change. The other thing is paying attention to the economic status. It's typically people who are wealthy tend to buy more expensive clothing. But there is a really weird phenomenon where you have people who are not great with money. They are living below paycheck to paycheck economic status, but they are spending hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on brand name shoes and jackets and clothing because they're trying to look fancy without actually being rich. Meanwhile, you take a look at a guy like Mark Zuckerberg, who created Facebook, and most of the time he's walking around in jeans and a hoodie. The guy's worth over $1 billion. He wears jeans and a hoodie on a daily basis. He doesn't dress like a millionaire or a billionaire. He dresses like some schlub out of college. All right, tip number 12. Make appropriate clothing accommodations based on gender, culture, and species. I'm just going to leave it at that because gender, species, and culture are going to be vastly different. If I have a character who is a dragon or some kind of dragon-ish, he's not going to be wearing the exact same outfit as someone who's like, a 4-foot tall imp. Clothing just isn't going to fit very well. All right. So yeah, we'll leave it at that. Another thing you can think of is, especially when you're talking about species, if you're doing something science fiction or fantasy, think about things those species need. So the Halo franchise is a great example. There's a species of alien called the Ungoi. The nickname for them is the Grunt, because they're small, they make this grunting sound. They don't breathe oxygen, they breathe methane on their home world. So their armor is fitted with a gas tank filled with methane, and they have these breathing masks on their faces. The moment you pop that breathing mask off of them, they struggle and they start panicking, and they have difficulty breathing. And so take that into consideration. You had a question, James? Huh? Oh, okay, I thought I saw your hand up. All right, tip number 13, make a clear decision about food availability in your world. How available is food going to be? How expensive is it going to be? What types of food are going to be available? All right. Is there going to be an issue with people having difficulty getting food? If so, why? Is food going to be readily available? If so, why? In the Star Trek universe, especially when you get into Star Trek: The Next Generation and further on into the timeline, they have technology called the food synthesizer, where you go up to the computer, you tell the computer, this is what I'd like to have to eat. It provides you a list of options or modifications, and it will materialize whatever that food is out of antimatter. Or I don't remember how exactly it works, but it doesn't. At no point does anybody on the ship need to worry about food. They don't have to worry about getting a supply shipment coming in. Everything is right there. They just walk up. I would like tea, Earl Grey, hot, and it's there. I would like a chocolate shake. It's there. All right. So think about how available food is. Tip 14, be creative with the cuisine in your world. Research recipes. I'm a big foodie, and so when I start looking at recipes or ideas for dishes that I want to have in my series, I start looking at food and what color, what flavors, what seasonings, what foodstuffs will actually work with one another and how they complement each other. One of my favorite authors is Ian Fleming. He's the guy that wrote the James Bond series. And one of the things I love about the books is that pretty much everywhere Bond goes, he's ordering food, and the food is described with exquisite detail, probably more so than the action is. Ian Fleming spends so much time describing the food and drink that James Bond eats and drinks. It is phenomenal, and the descriptions make me hungry every time I'm reading one of these books, because he's eating some really good stuff. And it makes me wish I could be a spy with that kind of a budget. Tip number 15, plan out how your characters spend their leisure time. Do your characters sit around writing stories? Do they play video games? Do they have a hobby like woodworking or metal crafting or scrapbooking? What hobbies do they have that they want to do in their free time? So James, what do you like to do in your free time? You like to play drums. Okay, so you're musically inclined. Cool. Virginia, what about you? Drawing. So you like to do something creative as well. My free time, I like to watch TV, I like to watch movies, because that's about the only downtime I get when I'm not having to be at work or I'm having to be a parent. If I feel inclined to do so, I will play video games. But I will go weeks, if not months, without playing a video game. And that's kind of one of my downtimes. So think about how characters spend their downtime. Tip number 16, list all major and minor laws and their punishments. Is it illegal to kill somebody? If so, what's the punishment? Is it illegal to read a book while walking down the street? If so, what's the punishment? Is it illegal in Hanford, California, which is where we are right now for those people who are watching online? Is it illegal to stop your kid from jumping into a puddle left after a rainstorm? Actually, it is. Punishment is like $5. it's not enforced because there's no way they can enforce it. It's really kind of dumb. But like, think about this. In the state of Oklahoma, it is illegal for an Oklahoma State resident to go harpooning a whale. Oklahoma's a landlocked state. There are no whales. In the state of Texas, if you are this is a law that's still on the books, they just don't enforce it. If you are a non-resident of Texas and you are arrested and put in jail for 30 days or more for a non-violent crime, that's the key word, non-violent, by law, the state of Texas is required to give you a horse and a rifle when you leave town. They won't enforce it now, but it would cost them more to remove it from the books than it would be to actually enforce it. So they just ignore it. So think about what laws are in favor at that time. All right, tip number 17, make prison designs unique to the types of inmates that they are holding. Avatar: The Last Airbender does this very well. In season 1, the firebenders imprison a bunch of earthbenders on a derrick out in the middle of a river. There's no earth anywhere around them, and they can't use their native element to break out of prison. The firebenders, on the other hand, who are working as guards, they can conjure fire at any time. They don't need to have a candle or a torch. They can generate it without fire being present. Earthbenders need the earth to be around them, although they forget that coal is actually a part of earth, and eventually they figure that one out. Or if you're a fire, they actually have another prison called the Boiling Rock, where if you are a firebender, they put you in what's called a cooling cell. It's pumped with natural coolant to keep you cold, so you cannot generate any heat whatsoever. James, is that a hand? Yeah, what's your question?
What would the prison be for Les Miserables?
I've never actually read Les Miserables, but that's probably a standard prison. The one that I know of that from classic literature is from the Count of Monte Cristo. The prison is called Chateau d'If. It's where Edmond Dantes is imprisoned for like 17 years for a crime he doesn't commit. And the prison is this huge fortress set on a rocky island, and the only food that comes in is shipments from the mainland. They don't have, there's no way off. The coast is, there's no way out. You're stuck in your prison cell the entire time. And the shore, there's only one area where boats can approach, and they can only do it like once a day. Otherwise, they'll hit the rocks. So think about the structure and the design. So like the Boiling Rock prison from Avatar: The Last Airbender, it's an island set inside of a volcanic crater that is filled with water that is literally boiling because of geothermal energy. There's no escape because there's no way to cross the river. The only way to get out of the prison is through a mechanized gondola system that hangs above the air. So you go to the edge of the crater, you take a gondola system down to the island, and if you want to leave, you take the gondola system back up, and then that's it. If they shut that system down, there's no escape. So detail characters' opinions about law enforcement, even if they're in law enforcement. Okay, there's a series I like to watch called Psych, and at the end of season 6, there's an episode where the main character's dad, who's a retired cop who's come back onto the force as a detective, like he realizes that a cold case that he had been working on 20 years earlier involved 3 of his buddies from the force who were crooked cops, and it completely disenfranchised him from working in police work again. So he resigns, he packs up his stuff, and he leaves. All because 3 of his buddies that he was really close to 20 years earlier had actually violated their oaths of the badge. So he believes in law enforcement, but he was disenfranchised by what he experienced. But then you've got characters who probably don't like law enforcement. And in fact, there's a lot of that in the media in the last few years. So think about how that opinion plays into your world. Tip number 19, use specific examples as a framework for your world's governments. So in my book series, the Republic of Chisen, I actually use the Roman Republic as the basis for the government structure there. So I did a lot of research on how the Roman Republic was supposed to operate, as far as its Senate, its Chancellor, and all of that for that framework. Tip number 20, decide how religion factors into your world building. Religions are huge. Major religions pop up because of major world changes, and some last for thousands of years. Others just mere centuries, and others are shorter lived, depending on what's going on. But how does religion factor into what's going on with the world building, as well as the history of the world? Tip number 21, make sure that tech matches the time period. If you have characters living in a medieval setting, it would be really anachronistic to have digital technology. Now, it can be done if you have a character who's traveled back in time, like in Back to the Future, where you have Marty McFly, who's working with he's got a Sony Walkman. It's got batteries. He can play music on it, and he uses it in the film to convince his dad, who is a teenager through the movie, to fall in love with his mom, so that he doesn't cease to exist in the future. But how does technology play into it? Because you want to make sure that things work in the right time period. If I'm setting something in the Stone Age, like say the Flintstones, it would be really anachronistic for them to have television, because they don't have any wiring or network signals to generate the imagery and the electromagnetic spectrum to make a television work. Tip number 22, how does magic help or hinder the technology in your world? So like I shared with Legend of Korra, the character Mako uses lightning bending to generate electricity for the rest of the city. So that they have electric lighting, they have telephones, they have radio, stuff like that. But there's a book that I read back in high school called The Dragons of the Cuyahoga, and it takes place in the real world, but this portal to a fantasy world opens up over the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. And any technology near that portal stops working. So it doesn't matter if it's a phone, radio, or some other type of device. The closer you get to that portal, no power whatsoever. So how does it help? How does it hinder? Tip number 23, decide in advance how hard or soft your magic system is going to be. This has to do more with the rules of magic and stuff like that. So like Dungeons and Dragons has a very hard system. It explains the cost of using magic, how prevalent magic is, what skills are usable, what skills are not, what your character has learned. A soft magic system would be like the Force in Star Wars. The Force can kind of do a lot of things. It makes Jedi telepathic. It makes them telekinetic. It gives them a boost of speed. They can jump higher heights. They can conjure electricity. No one's really sure what the limits are. Tip number 24, play around with family dynamics and gender roles. This can be a lot of fun, because if you have characters who are siblings, how do those siblings operate? You guys are siblings, right? So think about how the two of you operate when you are by yourselves. Do you guys get along? Do you not get along? Do you want to beat each other up? Do you want to sit on the other one? Do you want to duct tape one sibling to a chair and shave their head? Me and my brother, when we were kids, my parents would leave us alone, and we'd have a list of chores to do on the weekend. And like during the day while they were at work, I would start working on my set of chores. My brother would completely botch his, because he'd rather do whatever he wanted to do. And vice versa, it would happen both ways. But it would get to the point where I'd start demanding he help out with the chores, and he would just fight with me and argue with me. And finally, he would get so mad that he would come up, he would punch me in the back, and go running down the hall and hide under his bed covers. And he believed that if I couldn't see him, if he couldn't see me, I couldn't see him, that he was invisible. Which usually resulted in me body slamming him with my elbow. Okay? But my point is, those are the family dynamics that my brother and I had growing up. And then after my year abroad in Japan, I came back, my brother was bigger than me. He was a little bit stronger than me. I stopped body slamming him because I couldn't do that anymore. And the dynamic shifted. Now, my brother and I have also always been very competitive with one another. Correction, he's been competitive. I don't really buy into it. But I like to egg him on. He likes to egg me on. We tease each other. It will happen in family text message chains. It will happen in person until someone gets annoyed or we just get into an argument or whatever. The point is, those family dynamics happen. So if you want some examples of how characters operate in a family dynamic, pay attention to that. Pay attention to what goes on in your own household. Pay attention to what happens in your friends' households. One of the things that I do as a writer is I watch people. I'll go to a coffee shop, or I'll go to a restaurant, or I'll just sit somewhere, and I will watch how people behave. I'll watch how people operate. And you can automatically tell the characters who are related to each other versus the characters who have nothing to do with one another. You see those dynamics. And it also affects gender roles. In a family, like, how are girls treated versus how the boys are treated? How are the men treated versus how the women are treated? How are the young treated versus how the old are treated? Okay? Then we've got, let's see what time, almost there. Okay. So tip number 25, develop education based on restrictions, curriculum, costs, and ages. I'll leave that up to you guys to research. And then tip number 26, make use of Google Translate and BehindTheName.com for language. BehindTheName.com, we were talking about that last time when we were talking about character naming. But the reason why I do this is because if you have a character who is using another language, use Google Translate, because it will give you, for the most part, fairly conversational translations. Okay? Now, if you type in a phrase, like, where is the bathroom, it will literally translate it as, where's the bathroom, in whatever language you're going with. Donde está el baño is Spanish, okay? I don't remember what it is in Italian or French or German, but the point is, use common languages and use that, because if you don't know the language but you want to work with it, there you go. If you don't know the language but you have the character speaking in it, at least you can say he spoke in his native Russian tongue, or he spoke in his Lithuanian tongue, or she spoke Cantonese. That's another thing, is that you can't just say that a person spoke Chinese, because the Chinese language is actually broken into two major languages. You have Mandarin, which is spoken by the majority of people in China, but then you have a subset of people who speak Cantonese. But then you have other subsets who speak other dialects, like the Uyghurs in northern China and Mongolia. All right? So those are my tips. So here is our writing prompt. Okay, you're going to use the worksheet that I provided to further develop the world that the characters in your story are inhabiting. Check the boxes for the elements that are going to be crucial to your story and focus on those details. There are 9 questions here. Okay? So the first question is, what elements are necessary for your story? What you're going to do is you're going to circle those categories that are going to be crucial for your story. Number 2, how can you offer nuance and variation to landscape and transportation? 3, what infrastructures inconvenience your characters? 4, what does a day in the life look like for your characters based on class and culture? 5, what is the history of your world? Cosmic scale as well as timeline. Okay? Number 6, what details can you add to flesh out the details of your world? Number 7, how are your characters impacted by government, law enforcement, and economy? 8, does religion focus on something supernatural or technological? And there are differences in that. And number 9, what is more prevalent in your world, magic or technology? All right, so I'm going to give you guys the next 20 minutes to work on that. If you have any questions, I'll be right up here. All right, and that's the end of the live stream. Thank you for joining us, for those of you who did.